Hi, everyone. Welcome to our human-centered design training. I'm going to give everyone a chance to log on and just, put in the chat if you can hear us well or if you're having any issues technically so we can sort that out before we begin. One of our colleagues, Rachel, will be on chat monitoring that. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds just to do that and see if you can hear me clearly. Great. So we'll kick off with a couple of intros, and Rachel will be monitoring chat, so continue to just let her know if you guys can hear us okay. I'll start off with myself. I'm Roshan. I'm a product manager here at Exygy, and previously I was in the social sector, so I worked with several nonprofits and social enterprises, mostly in the Southeast, before joining Exygy. And at Exygy, one of my main clients is the City and County of San Francisco, specifically the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. So I do a fair bit of civic tech work here at Exygy and can help weave that in throughout the presentation. Shiba?
Yeah, my name is Shiba Najmi. I'm a senior user experience strategist here at Exygy. And prior to Exygy, I worked at Yahoo as a user experience design lead for nearly 7 years. And in 2012, I was a fellow at Code for America and then went on to found Code for Pakistan. So I work right at the intersection of civic technology and human-centered design. I've been doing human-centered design for about 12 years and civic technology for about 5. And
Great.
We have
Rachel over here. You can also introduce yourself.
Hi guys, I'm Rachel. I do operations at Exygy and I'll be monitoring the YouTube comments today. So let us know if you have any questions or any comments about our streaming.
Cool. And we'll also pause in the middle of the presentation for questions. So feel free to post questions and Rachel will surface a couple of those that we can answer in the middle. So I'm going to start screen sharing our presentation. All right. Great. So we're here today to talk about human-centered design. There's a lot to cover with human-centered design. So we're going to focus on needs finding and user testing today. We know that the teams that are participating in this upcoming sprint process have varying levels of expertise with human-centered design. So for those who are designers and have had experience with this before, this will be a little bit of a refresher course for you and a refresher for all of us to kind of ground ourselves in empathy for the user first before building. I know we have teams from the White House, from Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, Department of Labor, and all the other agencies participating in this sprint process online, as well as the tech teams, the designers and engineers that are going to tackle some of the problem sets set out by the federal agencies. I do want to say we are recording this, so we'll be able to post it later. So don't worry too much about taking super detailed notes. And that way you guys can refer back to the video as needed. So let's dive in. Like I mentioned, these are the folks that are going to be taking you through the training today. Shiba and I will be doing a lot of the presentation, and Rachel will be on chat. So a little bit about Exygy before we dive into human-centered design. Exygy is an agency based in San Francisco focused on the social sector. So we have 3 main lines of business, being strategy, design, and software. And we employ a really integrated approach to helping our clients who are in several different sectors, including clean tech, education, civic tech, and governance. We use all these business lines to help them solve really core social issues. So with strategy, we do a lot of discovery work, market research to help our clients set strategic direction. We have designers on our staff that are able to do research, user experience, and user interface design to really design experiences that both delight the user and solve really key pain points. And then we also have engineers that help implement products, both web and mobile, to meet the user's needs. So what is human-centered design? Human-centered design means that instead of jumping in directly to the build process, that we pause a little bit in the beginning. And we go directly to the user, and then we employ a lot of empathy techniques to understand really what our users' needs are, what their motivations are, and what their ultimate goals are. We do this first because it produces better products. If products are actually addressing users' needs, then they're going to have a longer shelf life. They're going to be able to actually solve a really key issue for the user. So instead of jumping directly into mock-ups or code, we pause at the beginning to center ourselves around empathy for the user. And that's at the core of human-centered design. This is the overarching human-centered design process. It involves several steps, and I'll go through each of these, and we're going to focus on just a couple of these steps today. So first is empathy. So empathy means observing, interacting, immersing yourself with the user and their experiences, and like I mentioned, really getting to the core of what they desire and how they're feeling and what their pain points are. Then you take everything you learn from the empathy phase and you move into definition. This is where you synthesize the empathy work and come up with a point of view or a problem set that you're addressing for the user. Essentially, you define your design challenge here. The third step is ideate. So you take your design challenge and you let your creativity flow. You let go of any preconceived notions that you might have, and you explore a wide range of solutions to the user's pain point through generating a ton of ideas. There's no judgment at this stage, essentially. The fourth stage is prototyping. So you take all the ideas you came up with during the ideation stage, and you pick a couple, and you prototype solutions with those ideas. And what you really want to do here is create some sort of physical prototype. This could be on paper, a digital mock-up, hardware, something created with cardboard, a sketch of a service design, anything that you could essentially put in front of someone. Because what you'll be doing in the test phase is putting that prototype in front of a user and testing that design. So in the test phase, the design is being tested, not the user. You learn from their interaction and incorporate learnings into improving the prototype or even coming up with more ideas, going back into ideation a little bit. So in our presentation today, we'll be focusing on the empathize phase and the test phase. And we're doing this because these are the two phases where you're really going to interact with users the most and learn from them. So I'm going to hand it off to Shiba, who will kick us off.
Thanks, Roshan. So Roshan mentioned the overall user experience design process, and the first step in the process is building empathy with your user. In your sprint where you are right now, you already have the problem statement defined by the agencies. So empathy can be used to refine the problem statement and discover new user needs that might emerge. The way you build empathy is you understand your user's needs and goals and pain points and motivations. And you can do that in a number of different ways, and there are a number of techniques or methods that you can employ to understand your user's needs. This is called doing needs finding user research. Usually, the problem statement would emerge from the needs finding process, but in our case here, you're utilizing subject matter experts that already have a pulse on the issues. So when you're doing needs finding user research, you go in with an open mind towards discovering additional information that can help you refine the particular problem that you want to solve. So there are a number of different ways in which you can do needs finding, which are along a spectrum of how much time you can afford to spend with your user. For instance, if you can go and stay with your user to observe their daily experiences, or you can be light touch and send out surveys or look at customer support and complaint logs. But the method that we found most useful for needs finding is conducting one-on-one needs finding interviews with people who might be considered end users of the domain that you're working within. So we'll take a look at how you can conduct your own needs-finding interviews. We'll talk about the interview process and a couple of key artifacts that can come out of the interviews. A user interview is just where someone asks one-on-one questions and records responses from users. You can consider three main parts to conducting a user interview. The first being selecting and recruiting users. The second being planning and preparing an interview script. And the third being actually conducting the interview. So for the first step, recruiting participants, you want to try to capture a diverse set of users. If you want your research to inspire new opportunities, then it's usually helpful to find people who are on the extremes. Say, for example, you want to interview users who use public transit. Then you might interview a power user who uses all modes of public transit. They use trains and metros and buses. And they have multiple passes for each. And this person might be very active and vocal in local politics surrounding transportation. And on the other extreme, you might interview someone who maybe only occasionally uses one mode of transportation, like the bus. The other thing you want to do is you want to use the rule of thirds when recruiting participants. So a third of your participants should be ideal early adopters who successfully adopt new ways of doing things. And a third of participants should be on the opposite end, those who resist change, or they might exhibit what you might consider inefficient behaviors. And a third should be somewhere in the middle. You can approximate if necessary. Say your domain is around trains, but you're having a hard time recruiting train riders. Then you might interview metro riders or people who take other related forms of public transit, because it's much better to talk to some users who are proxies rather than talk to no users. And then finally, it's important to screen the participants. So you might ask participants a few questions via email or by survey to make sure that they fit within your target user group, such as what forms of transit do you use on a weekly basis? How often do you use each form of transit? And then the second step is to create your interview script. In the script, you'll have an introduction where you explain the purpose of the interview. What are you trying to achieve? You'll try to collect background information on the participant, such as ethnographic data. And as much as possible, try to collect this from observation rather than always having to ask directly, such as you can observe whether or not the participant uses a smartphone, or you can sort of guess at their age. You probably want to explain to the participant how their data that you're collecting will be used. And if you have any release forms, have them sign those. And then in your interview, you want to avoid certain types of questions. Like you want to avoid leading questions like, do you like riding the train? Because that might already predispose the person towards saying yes. You want to avoid questions that have straightforward yes or no answers, because you want questions that are open-ended so that they elicit conversation. You want to avoid asking users what they want in hypothetical scenarios, because that requires the user to imagine things, and that's not where their expertise is. They're experts in their own lives, so you want to ask them about their days and their pain points. And you, as the designer, are tasked with actually coming up with the solution. And then finally, you want to avoid asking users how often they do something, because then it makes them guess or estimate, and it's usually not accurate. So for instance, instead of asking, how often do you take the train, a better question might be, describe how you got to work this morning. That way you can be more specific and ask about their past behaviors. You want to give users a bit of time to answer. So pause on your end, and that will help allow them the space to respond. And then it's really important to let the user know that you're not evaluating them and that there are no right or wrong answers. Feel free to go off script. Don't feel limited by your test guide. The goal is just to figure out the user's main objectives and motivations and pain points. And then the third step is to actually conduct the interview. Ideally, you'll have one person conducting the interview while you have another person taking detailed notes. And if you can, try to record the interview so you can go back and review your notes. Keep it reasonably short, ideally 30 minutes long, but no longer than an hour. And the majority of the time spent should be the interviewee talking and you as the researcher listening. When taking notes, the note taker can write things down verbatim and wait for synthesis afterwards. But alternatively, some note takers prefer to draw inferences as they go along, but that can be distracting for the note taking. We'd said earlier that to be a user researcher, you need to have deep empathy for users. The other thing you need is a beginner's mindset. So even when you think you might know the answer, ask people why they do or say things. The answers will sometimes surprise you. In this example here, you might ask the user, what are you trying to get done? And they might say, trying to build a fence and a gate. And then you would want to ask why. And they would say, so that I can surround my front yard. And you might say, why? And they would say, so that I can plant a garden. You might ask, why? So that I can grow my own food. Why? So that I can save money on groceries. And that way you really discover the root cause when you drill down and figure out what it is that's the actual motivation for what the user is trying to get done. What we don't ask users during needs finding research is what the solution is, because we don't expect users to be the designers. We ask them about their pain points and their needs so that we can understand them better. Especially if you're trying to create a new product or experience that doesn't exist yet, you'll want to know what's causing people to not be able to do what they want with the tools they currently have. That way you can design either for an entirely new experience or an incremental improvement that helps the user get the job done. So as a result of the user interviews, you will develop a greater understanding of your users' needs and goals and motivations and pain points. There are several ways you can synthesize the findings from your user interviews. You can focus on extracting qualitative data like quotations or quantitative data like the number of times the user said X. You can also create a few artifacts that can help the team empathize with the user. Two key artifacts that we like to bring out of our user interviews are empathy maps, which are similar to personas, but they're a lot quicker to create, and user journey maps. And I'll walk you through both of those. So empathy maps are most useful at the beginning of the design process. An empathy map is helpful because it helps the team focus on the underlying why behind the user's actions so that we can proactively design for their real needs. It's a visual artifact that people can internalize. It allows the team to prioritize feature requests with the user's needs in mind, and it can be used to validate or disprove design decisions. A typical user experience empathy map is divided into 3 to 4 quadrants outlining different aspects of the user's internal experience. The quadrants can vary based on what your team needs, but here's one that I like to use. It has these 3 quadrants of feelings. How is the user feeling about the experience? Tasks. What tasks is the user trying to accomplish? And then influences. What peoples or things or places may influence how the user acts. And then the bottom 2 pieces are the problems or the pain points, any obstacles that are worth considering, for example, an unfamiliarity with technology or a short attention span, and goals, like what the user hopes to accomplish. For instance, in the transit example that I gave earlier, a user's goal might be to not lose money if she forgets to tag off the train. And then to create an empathy map, you should probably set aside 45 to 60 minutes for the session and have the skeleton framework of an empathy map drawn on a whiteboard. You'd have your whole team together and you would digest your user interview notes onto Post-its and place them in each quadrant. You might scribble quotes across the tasks and influences and feelings. You would do one empathy map for each interviewee, and you would have a moderator pose questions like, what environment is the user in? Are they having fun or do they want to get it over with? And then once you've mapped this out for one person, you would review the completed empathy maps and discuss any patterns and outliers and what might impact or influence your designs the most. As you're going through the above exercise, you'll probably also have ideas for your project. So you can create a section on the right where you capture ideas as you go along. In addition to empathy maps, another artifact that you can create from your needs finding interviews are user journey maps. User journey maps show all the things that are happening and how all the backend systems work together to create the user experience across the journey. When we map the user journey, it helps us contextualize what we're designing from the user's perspective, and it helps us keep that point of view as the focus of our design. A user journey map that's based in user research is really helpful because it helps you capture and synthesize the current experience of real people. It shows how things work or they don't work and what the interdependencies are. It highlights the pain points and where things might be broken, and then covers the most significant opportunities for improvement. The process of mapping user journeys is particularly useful in government because the things being built across government will usually be a component of bigger services, which are also a part of a user's broader journey. So they show you how your service or transaction fits into this bigger service, and they highlight what other things might need to change and who you need to be talking to in order to make those changes happen. The type of user journey maps we use are made up of a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. Basically, they're a grid. The horizontal axis contains all the steps. Like, when does the user's need for this service arise? What does the user do first? What phases does the person go through? Are there specific activities within each phase? When does the journey end? Is it one time or cyclical? All of that goes horizontally. And then on the vertical axis, you contain any additional layers of information that you might need in order to understand the user journey. These are generally, one, the emotion that the user is experiencing, which might be frustration or anxiety or happiness. There would be touch points, any interactions that the user has with the organization or the product. This is what the customer is doing. For example, the touch point could be pay a bill. And then the third thing might be channels, which is the channel that the service is delivered through, which could be the phone or web or mail or face-to-face, wherever the interaction is taking place and the context of use. When you're creating a journey map, you want to get your team together around a whiteboard, and you want to make it a collaborative exercise. And you'll pick a specific user whose journey you want to map. It's good to have a facilitator moderate and ask the team questions as you put together all the pieces, the timeline, the touch points, the channels, the emotional highs and lows. And the way the facilitator might do this is they might typically stand by the whiteboard and ask, how does the user first hear about you? And then they might ask, what's the next thing that happens? And the next. And you would put smiley faces on sticky notes and pin that on the user journey to illustrate the emotion of the user. That way you sketch out the whole journey from point A to point B, using post-its for each step in the journey and for each user emotion. At the end of mapping the journey, the team should identify the problems and the opportunities and then prioritize them either through discussion or through voting. And for both empathy maps and user journey maps, it's helpful to print these out and put them up on a wall where everyone can refer to them during the design process.
Great, thanks, Shiba. So I want to pause here a bit for questions. We've gone over one approach to needs finding, which is user interviews, and some outcomes that could come out of user interviews, which are empathy maps and journey maps. So I want to see if there's any questions that have come up on the channel. Rachel's saying no, so I think we can keep going and reserve questions for the end. Great. So grounding ourselves back in the overall design process, we've talked about empathy, and we will talk about test now. Like I mentioned, all of the work that comes out of empathy helps you define a design challenge in the define phase. And here you really want your challenge to be narrow enough to be manageable, but also broad enough to offer a sense of possibility. You want the challenge to focus on humans, not organizations or products. So one example of this could be, instead of saying, how can we get more people to use public transit, we can ask, how can we help families travel safely around the city? And then in the prototyping phase, the goal is really to build something build an MVP as quickly as possible so that you can get it out the door to test the design and the assumptions you made. So Sheba is going to take us back into the test phase.
Thanks, Roshan. So when we're doing user testing, you want to make sure you test your design direction as early as possible and as frequently as possible so that you know whether or not it will work for actual users. And so as soon as you might have a lightweight, even paper sketch or paper prototype, you can test it. It's similar in some ways to the skeleton structure of user interviews, but there are some key differences because now we're putting the product in front of users. So the key steps to setting up a user test are: 1, to recruit users; 2, to figure out where you're going to hold the test; and then 3, to create a test script along with some tasks that you will want to ask your test participants to do. So looking at step 1, recruiting users, if you look at this graph that was created by Jacob Nielsen a long time ago, what it shows is that testing with 5 users is enough to drive a useful iterative cycle. So in other words, once you've conducted 5 test sessions, stop testing and correct the serious problems that you found, because beyond that, there are diminishing returns. Then after you've done a design iteration, then you can conduct additional test sessions if you have the ability to do so. But the idea is to get frequent feedback by running small tests more often. Ideally, you would test every week. Another key thing on this graph is that 0 users gives 0 insights. So if you don't talk to any users, you really don't have any insights, and talking to even 1 user gives exponentially much more insight than talking to 0. So the next step is, where should you test? If at all possible, it would be beneficial to go to users to avoid any bias of them feeling like they need to please the interviewer, which they might feel if you call them to your office. Ideally, you would test where users would actually be completing the task, but if you can't, then even a coffee shop is fine. And then the third step is to have a test script to make sure that you're asking all the test participants the same questions and you aren't accidentally asking leading questions. So at the beginning of the study, you'll often give the user a context of use. You'll make up some kind of scenario which helps them understand or imagine why they're using the prototype. Then you'll give them some tasks to do so that you can see how they interact with the prototype. There are 3 types of tasks you can give participants in a usability test. You can give them verb-based tasks, scavenger hunt tasks, and interview-based tasks. Verb-based tasks are basically ones where all the tasks begin with a verb and they ask users to complete a specific action. For example, if you're testing an email system, you might ask users to respond to the email that you just received from Kate. With scavenger hunt tasks, we ask users to find a specific piece of information. And these tasks almost always begin with the verb find. And an example of a scavenger hunt task and a scenario that you might give could be something like telling the user, you were at a party last week. The discussion turned to recipes for authentic Italian pasta dishes. Go to the Food Network site and find an Italian recipe for pasta. And then with interview-based tasks at the beginning of the test, we interview users typically to get a better idea of how they use a product. For example, if you're evaluating an email system, you might start by asking users specific questions like, show me how you usually use email. That way we see how they use the product. In practice, we often combine all 3 types of tasks in any given test. During the test, there's some things to keep in mind. Make sure that the user understands that you're not testing them. You're trying to improve the product so that it works better for them. If you can, remember to record the test. And then you'll have to instruct the user to think aloud, which is a technique in which they verbalize their thoughts about what they're trying to do. So they're not providing a critique, but they're just revealing their cognitive process in words. You'll ask them to show me how you do that. You'll make sure you don't ask by providing their reason. Like, you won't say things like, is the reason you don't click this button because it's really hard to see? Because that's leading. But then you may also, I would recommend avoid asking things like, why didn't you click this button? Because that implies that the user has done something wrong. But instead, see if you can be creative about exploring the participants' understanding of the interface. For example, you might ask them to talk about what they think each button does. And then avoid asking about the future. The best way to predict somebody's future behavior is to look at their past behavior. And you can continue this ideate, prototype, test loop as much as you want to continue learning whether or not your product works for your users. And once you have a fully flushed product, you can continue to test it in the same way. So those are ideal outcomes of user testing, and then I'll hand it back to Roshan.
Great. So like Sheba just mentioned, this is really a loop. This is a cycle you can use throughout your current sprint process, but also after it to continue improving the product. So testing can feed back into ideation and also back into the prototype and improvement upon that prototype. And just to kind of go over what we talked about. So we talked about the empathy phase and the test phase. In empathy, we talked about user interviews that can create empathy maps and journey maps. And then the test phase, we talked about user testing once you already have a product. And one thing I would like to mention about empathy maps and journey maps, if your teams are co-located in the same area, it's really good to put these artifacts on the wall and essentially create kind of a little bit of a war room for your team so that you can continually remind yourselves the journey that you're focusing on and the user that you're focusing on, and ground yourselves in that for each feature decision, each design decision, and throughout the build process. And I think that's the conclusion of our presentation. I know we have at least a couple questions that have come through, so we'd like to address them. Rachel, do you want to say them out loud?
Sure. So our first question is, do you guys have any useful recommended tools for the 3 tactics mentioned in the needs finding segment? Like different apps that you use or anything like that?
So throughout needs finding, so specifically tools for the interview process, empathy maps and journey maps?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I can speak to this a little bit first and maybe Sheba can jump in. So empathy maps and journey maps to me are very physical. So I think the use of Post-its and a whiteboard and things like that to really sketch things out is what I'd encourage the most. I'd almost kind of discourage a little bit the use of digital tools. And that way you can be really messy. You can connect the dots between things that might seem like they're far apart. You can put arrows. And once you kind of do that in a messy way, you can distill it more digitally. And what we can do is send out a couple of really good examples of journey maps. We had some in the slides, but I know they might have been hard to read quickly. And there are different ways you can do it. So throughout on the top, the horizontal axis, Sheba mentioned, those are the steps in the process. The vertical axis, you can do a lot of different things. So you can say, the emotion at each step. You can say the method they're using. So email, or they're blogging, or they're walking in through the front door, like, the channel essentially. You can say if other users or other stakeholders are involved in the interaction. So there's a lot of flexibility in that vertical axis as to how you describe each step in the user's journey. Sheba, are there any other digital tools you would want to suggest after they kind of whiteboard?
Yeah, so for journey maps, for instance, there's a tool which I haven't dug into in a lot of detail myself, but it's called Expressia, and that's UXPRESSIA. And essentially you can create customer journey maps online. But to Roshan's point, I would do this as a collaborative team exercise in person first, map it all out on Post-its, and get a sort of consolidated understanding, and then flush it out. And then what's also really great is afterwards, if you do have a digital version, which you can use a tool like Expressia or create in Sketch yourself or in Illustrator. Once you map that all out, you can actually even do that in PowerPoint or Keynote. But once you map it all out, what I recommend is printing that really on a big scale and having that up so that the whole team can rally around and refer to the important pieces of the journey, as well as for empathy maps, rally around who your user persona is.
Yeah, one more tool that might be helpful for you guys is Look Back. This is a little bit more of a tool for user testing because it allows you to record how the user is interacting with the product. So it records the screen essentially. It could be useful in the user interview stage if you are asking someone, in the example of, hey, go look up this recipe on this recipe site, and you want to kind of see how they do it. Look Back is a good tool for that. But other than that, I think simple audio and or video during the user interview process so that you can go back and transcribe the interview or pull specific quotes out instead of really relying on your memory to remember what happened with the test.
And then for user interviews or even for user testing, for the part where you're recruiting users, what can be a tool that I've used in the past that I really like is, say I want to recruit users who go to the city's website, then I might install a line of JavaScript through there's a site called Ethnio, which is ethn.io. And on Ethnio, you can use that tool to recruit users. You can just sort of insert that line of JavaScript on the city's website where it'll show a little pop-up when people come to that particular page where you have that line of JavaScript. And that pop-up will say, hey, do you have 25 minutes or 30 minutes for a user interview or for a user test? And that way, say your demographic that you're targeting for the user test is people who visit the driver's license page on the city's website. Well, you can intercept anybody who's on that page, and then they fill out. You can ask them a few questions through Ethnio to make sure that they are the right people that you want to recruit, and then you can set up a user test with them. So it's just a way for recruiting, for intercepting people, giving them a quick survey to make sure they are the right people, and then setting up a user test with them or a user interview.
Great. I'm going to take us out of presentation mode so that you guys can see our faces again. Great. So I think that was the only question we had, right, Rachel? Oh, there's one more.
One more. About user interviews. Do you offer compensation? If not, how do you make it worthwhile for the users?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, so we generally do. I think you guys can do it based on the market you're in. We have, given gift cards for $25 for each interview that lasts around 30 minutes. That's kind of our standard. But anything in that range, I think, is useful. And then just making sure the compensation is consistent for all of the users throughout the process. And I think it is really a best practice to give compensation so that the users don't feel like you're taking advantage of their time and you are giving them something in exchange for their feedback. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
That's it. We can give it another few seconds if you guys want to post.
Yeah. Feel free to post. And I know we're also on Slack. So we're happy to answer any follow-up questions, or perhaps Aiden and Zach and the White House team can funnel questions our way too. And yeah, we want to just thank everyone for joining, and hopefully this was really helpful to kind of kick you guys off in sort of a user-centered mindset throughout the sprint process. And we are all really excited to see what comes out of all the teams working on these problem sets.
Yeah, and we're available via email as well. You probably got my email and Roshan's email and our email addresses. So throughout the sprint processes, you might have any questions, or you're trying to set up your research, user research, or any part of your ideation process. Even if it's a simple question, feel free to ping us. We're very excited for the work that you guys are doing. We care about civic tech and user-centered design. This is what we like. So happy to help in any way possible.
Great. Any final questions, Rachel? No? Awesome. All right, guys. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you online.
Bye.